The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. James sat in the stiff plastic chair beside his father's bed, watching the monitors beep in their steady rhythm. His dad looked smaller than he remembered, thinner, like the illness had stolen more than just his health. "There's something I need to tell you," his father said, his voice rough and tired. "Something about the Montana Project." James leaned forward. The Montana Project was everything to their family business. 2 years of planning, millions of dollars invested, and the future of Richardson Development hanging in the balance. They were supposed to break ground in 3 months. "What about it?" James asked. His father closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, there was something in his expression that James had never seen before. "Shame, maybe, or regret. Your grandfather made a promise, a long time ago, back in 1987. He took land that didn't belong to him, land that belonged to the Crowfeather tribe. He knew it was wrong, but he did it anyway because the profit was too good to pass up." James felt his stomach drop. "Dad, what are you saying?" "Years later, the tribe found out. They had every right to sue us, to expose everything. But their chief at the time, a man named William, he offered your grandfather a different deal. He said one day our families would unite, that his daughter would marry into our family, and that would settle the debt. Make things right. This couldn't be real." James stood up, pacing to the window. Outside, Seattle was gray and rainy, same as always. Everything looked normal out there, but in this hospital room his whole world was tilting sideways. "You're telling me grandfather agreed to some kind of arranged marriage? Like we're living in the 1800s? "He signed a contract," his father said quietly. "A binding agreement. And I tried to get out of it. When William passed away 5 years ago, I thought maybe the whole thing would just go away. But his daughter, she's the chief now, and she's holding us to it." James turned around. "This is insane. You can't actually expect me to. If we don't honor this agreement, they'll go public with everything. The illegal land acquisition, the forged documents, all of it. We'll lose everything, James. The company, our reputation, everything your grandfather built. And it's not just us. We have 43 employees counting on their paychecks, families depending on this business." The weight of it pressed down on James's chest. 43 families. His father's legacy, everything. "What's her name?" he finally asked. "Ayanna. She's 30 years old. That's all I know." 3 weeks later, James found himself driving through Montana on a road that seemed to stretch forever. The landscape was nothing like Seattle. Here everything was big and open, with mountains in the distance and sky that went on for miles. His lawyer had reviewed the contract. It was real, legally binding, and absolutely airtight. The tribe's current lawyer had made that very clear in several phone calls. James could refuse, of course. Nobody could actually force him to marry anyone. But the consequences would destroy everything his family had built. He'd spent those 3 weeks angry. Angry at his grandfather for making such a stupid promise. Angry at his father for trying to back out of it and making things worse. Angry at himself for being the one who had to fix it all. But mostly, if he was honest, he was scared. The reservation appeared gradually. First a gas station, then a few houses, then more buildings clustered together. It wasn't what he'd expected. Some of the houses were old and worn down, sure, but there was also a modern community center, a school that looked recently built, and a medical clinic with solar panels on the roof. He pulled up to the address he'd been given. It was a large wooden building, traditional in style but well-maintained. Several people stood outside watching his car with expressions that weren't exactly welcoming. A woman in her 50s approached as he got out. "You must be James Richardson." "Yes, ma'am, I'm Helen, Ayanna's aunt." "Come inside. We have things to discuss before the ceremony." "The ceremony is today?" James felt panic rise in his throat. "Tomorrow morning. Today, you learn what's expected of you." The next few hours were a blur of information. The customs he needed to follow. The words he needed to say. The traditional gifts that had already been prepared on his behalf. Helen explained everything in a tone that made it clear she didn't approve of any of this, but would make sure it was done properly anyway. "Where is she?" James finally asked. "Ayanna. Shouldn't we at least meet before?" "She'll see you at the ceremony," Helen said firmly. "Not before." That night, James stayed in a small guest house on the reservation. He couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about his life back in Seattle, his apartment overlooking the water, his friends, his girlfriend, well, ex-girlfriend now. That had been an awkward conversation. He thought about the woman he was supposed to marry tomorrow. What did she look like? What was her voice like? Did she hate him for this? She had to, right? Nobody wanted to be forced into marriage with a complete stranger. Morning came too fast. Helen arrived early with traditional clothes for him to wear. These belong to Ayana's father, she said, her voice softening slightly. He was a good man. He would have wanted this day to be about unity, not obligation. The ceremony was held outdoors, in a clearing surrounded by pine trees. Dozens of people gathered, members of the tribe dressed in their finest. James stood where Helen positioned him, feeling completely out of place in borrowed clothes, about to marry a woman whose face he hadn't even seen. Then she appeared. Ayana walked slowly toward him and James forgot to breathe. She wore traditional regalia, intricate beadwork catching the morning sun. Her face was painted with precise geometric patterns in red and white. Her long dark hair was braided with leather and feathers. She moved with a dignity that made everyone else fade into the background. But it was her eyes that struck him. Even from a distance, even through the ceremonial paint, he could see them. Dark and intelligent and completely, utterly cold, she looked at him like he was nothing. Like he was an obstacle, a problem to be solved, a box to be checked. There was no curiosity there, no nervousness, no emotion at all. The ceremony began. An elder spoke in a language James didn't understand. Then in English, explaining the sacred nature of marriage, the joining of families, the responsibilities they were taking on. James said his part when prompted. The words felt hollow in his mouth. When it was Ayana's turn to speak, she said the words clearly and correctly. But she never looked at him, not once. She stared straight ahead, her jaw set, her expression unreadable behind the paint. They were pronounced married. People clapped politely. Ayana turned and walked away without a word, without a glance, without acknowledging that James existed at all. He stood there, married to a stranger who had just made it perfectly clear that she wanted nothing to do with him, and somehow that hurt more than he'd expected. He'd been prepared for anger, for resentment, but not for this complete indifference, like he wasn't even worth her anger. Helen touched his arm gently. "Give her time," she said quietly. But as James watched his new wife disappear into the crowd, he wondered if all the time in the world would be enough. The reception after the ceremony was awkward in a way that made James want to disappear. People were polite but distant. They congratulated him with tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. He stood alone most of the time, holding a plate of food he couldn't eat, watching his new wife talk and laugh with everyone except him. She'd washed off the ceremonial paint and changed into jeans and a simple blue shirt. Without all the traditional regalia, she looked different, younger, more real somehow, but still completely unreachable. Every time James tried to approach her, she would smoothly move to another group of people. It wasn't obvious enough to be rude, but it was clear enough. The message was received. Stay away. Helen found him standing by himself near the food tables. "Your cabin is ready," she said. "It's just past the community center, the one with the green door." "Our cabin?" James asked hopefully. Helen's expression answered before her words did. "Your cabin. Ayana has her own place, of course she did." The cabin was small but comfortable. One room with a bed, a tiny kitchen area, and a bathroom that had seen better days. James's suitcase sat on the floor where someone had left it. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands. What was he supposed to do now? Stay here for how long? The contract didn't specify. Would they need to live together eventually? Would she ever even speak to him? A knock on the door interrupted his spiral of thoughts. For a second, his heart jumped. Maybe it was Ayana. Maybe she was coming to talk, to explain, to something. But when he opened the door, it was a young boy, maybe 10 years old, holding an envelope. "This is for you," the boy said, then ran off before James could ask any questions. Inside the envelope was a single piece of paper with a list written in neat, precise handwriting. Rules 1. Do not come to my home uninvited. 2. Do not expect me to play the role of your wife. 3. Respect our customs and our people. 4. Do not embarrass me or my family with your presence here. 5. This marriage is a legal arrangement, nothing more. When the time is right, we will end it. There was no signature. No greeting. No explanation of what "when the time is right" meant. James read the list 3 times. Then he crumpled it up, threw it across the room, and immediately felt stupid for the childish gesture. He picked it up, smoothed it out, and read it again. Fine, if that's how she wanted it, fine. He didn't want to be here anyway. The next morning, James woke up to silence. No traffic sounds, no sirens, no city noise. Just birds and wind in the trees. It was unsettling. He walked to the community center, hoping to find coffee and maybe some answers about what he was supposed to do with himself. Instead, he found Ayana's Aunt Helen working in what looked like an office. "Morning," she said, not looking up from her computer. "There's coffee in the kitchen. Help yourself." The coffee was strong and bitter and exactly what he needed. James sat at a table near the window, watching people go about their day.
Kids heading to school.
Adults going to work. Normal life, except nothing about his situation was normal. "How long do I need to stay here?" he asked Helen when she came in for her own coffee. She studied him for a long moment. "That's between you and Ayana. She won't talk to me. Can you blame her?" The question hit harder than it should have. "I didn't want this either," James said defensively. "I'm a victim of this arrangement just as much as she is." Helen's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Boy, you have no idea what you're talking about. You think this is the same for both of you? You came here from your nice life in Seattle, your good job, your freedom to do whatever you want. This is her home. These are her people, and she had to marry a stranger to protect all of it because of what your grandfather did." James opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. She had a point. So what am I supposed to do? Just exist here? Wait for her to decide when I can leave? "You could try learning something," Helen said. "Understanding why you're here in the first place." She left before he could ask what she meant. The days started to blur together. James would wake up, make coffee, walk around the reservation feeling useless and out of place. He saw Ayana sometimes from a distance. She was always busy, always surrounded by people who clearly respected her. She ran meetings, settled disputes, made decisions with a confidence that made it clear why she was chief, but she never looked his way. It was like he was invisible to her. On the 5th day, James found a book on his doorstep. No, just a book. The History of the Crowfeather People, by someone named Dr. Robert Whitehorse. He almost didn't read it. It felt like homework, like something he was being forced to do, but he was bored and had nothing else to occupy his time, so he started reading. The first chapter made him uncomfortable. It detailed the arrival of white settlers in Montana, the promises made and broken, the systematic theft of land. His land, well, his family's land. The second chapter was worse. It talked about specific families who'd gotten rich by pushing the Crowfeather people off their ancestral territory. The Richardson name appeared 3 times. By chapter 5, James felt sick. He'd known abstractly that his grandfather had done something wrong. But reading the details, seeing the scope of what had been taken, understanding the generations of harm it had caused, it was different. The next morning there was another book. This one about broken treaties and legal battles that native tribes had lost not because they were wrong, but because the system was rigged against them. Then articles, printed out research papers about modern reservation life, about poverty rates and health disparities and educational challenges, about how past injustices created present-day struggles. Every morning something new appeared on his doorstep, and every morning James read it. He started to understand why people on the reservation looked at him with suspicion. Why Ayana had walked away at their wedding. Why this marriage, this arrangement, was the best outcome her people could hope for when they should have gotten justice instead. 2 weeks after the wedding, James saw Ayana outside the community center, talking to a group of kids. They were laughing at something she said. When she smiled, her whole face changed. She looked younger, lighter, free of the weight she carried around adults. Then she saw him watching. The smile disappeared instantly. She said something to the kids and walked away in the opposite direction. But this time something was different. This time James didn't feel rejected. He felt ashamed, because now he understood at least a little bit what his presence here represented to her. Every time she looked at him, she was reminded of what her people had lost, what they'd been forced to accept. That night, James sat in his cabin and wrote a letter. He didn't know if she'd read it, but he needed to try. "Ayana, I've been reading what you left for me. I understand now, or I'm starting to. I can't change what my grandfather did. I can't fix the past, but I want you to know that I see it now. I see the injustice. I see why you have every right to hate me. I don't know what you want from me or how long I need to stay here, but whatever it is, I'll do it. This debt, it's real, and I want to help pay it, even though I know nothing I do can really make up for what was taken." He left it on her doorstep before he could second-guess himself. The next morning, there was an envelope waiting for him. Inside was his letter, unread and unopened, with a single word written on the outside. Now James sat there holding the returned letter, and for the first time since arriving on the reservation, he felt something other than confusion or resentment. He felt determined. She didn't want his apology. She didn't want his guilt. Fine. He'd figure out what she did want, even if it took him months, even if she never spoke a word to him, because the more he learned about her people and their history, the more he realized that Ayanna wasn't just a stranger he'd been forced to marry. She was someone fighting for her family, for her community, for justice, and that was something James could respect, even if she would never respect him. The silence between them continued, but now it felt different. Now it felt like the beginning of something, though James couldn't have said what. 3 weeks into the strangest marriage in history, James discovered the reservation library. It was a small building tucked behind the school, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. He found it by accident while taking one of his aimless walks around the community. The librarian, an older man named Thomas, looked up when James entered. "You're the husband," he said. Not a question. "Yeah," James admitted, expecting the usual cool reception. But Thomas surprised him. "Good, you need books. Come here." For the next hour, Thomas loaded James up with reading material, not just history books this time, but personal accounts, memoirs from tribal elders, collections of oral histories, documentaries on USB drives that Thomas insisted he watch. "Ayanna asked me to help you," Thomas said as James left with a backpack full of borrowed materials. "She wants you to understand." It was the first confirmation James had that the books appearing on his doorstep weren't random. Ayanna was curating his education even if she wouldn't speak to him. That night, James watched a documentary about the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. He learned about families torn apart, children sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their own language, cultures systematically destroyed in the name of assimilation. He fell asleep with his laptop still playing interviews with survivors, their voices describing losses that could never be recovered. The materials kept coming, each one built on the last, creating a comprehensive picture of injustice that spanned generations. James learned about the Dawes Act, which broke up communal tribal lands into individual parcels that could be bought or taken. He learned about the legal loopholes that allowed companies and individuals to claim native land through fraud and manipulation, and he learned about his own grandfather's specific crimes. The Richardson Development Company had acquired 4,000 acres in 1987 through a series of forged documents and backdoor deals. The land had been designated for the Crowfeather tribe as part of a settlement. But before the transfer could be completed, James's grandfather had stepped in with lawyers and paperwork that made the whole thing look legitimate. By the time the tribe realized what had happened, the legal window for challenging the acquisition had closed, or so everyone thought. One morning, James found something different on his doorstep. A thin folder containing copies of legal documents, land surveys, property deeds, and a handwritten timeline in Ayanna's precise writing, showing exactly how the theft had been accomplished. At the bottom she'd written, "Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing. He stole our future to build his fortune." James sat on his cabin steps reading through the evidence. His hands were shaking by the time he finished. This wasn't just some gray area business deal. This was deliberate theft, carefully planned and executed. And the land stolen wasn't just valuable because of its development potential. It was sacred ground, home to burial sites and ceremonial locations that the tribe had used for centuries. He needed to talk to his father. The phone call didn't go well. "You're getting too wrapped up in this," his father said, his voice weak but firm. "Remember why you're there. To save our company, to preserve our family's legacy." "Dad, did you know about the burial sites? About what that land meant to them?" There was a long pause. "Business is complicated, James. Sometimes there are costs." "Costs? You mean destroying sacred sites? Stealing land from people who had already lost so much? Don't be naive. Your grandfather built everything we have. He did what he had to do to succeed. James ended the call feeling like he didn't know his own father, or maybe he was just seeing him clearly for the first time. That afternoon, James did something he'd been wanting to do for weeks. He knocked on Ayana's door, no answer. He tried again the next day, and the day after that, on the fourth attempt, the door finally opened. Ayana stood there, expression neutral, saying nothing. "I read everything," James said quickly before she could close the door. "I understand now. What my grandfather did, what my family took from yours. I'm sorry isn't enough, I know that. But I need you to know that I see it. I see the whole ugly truth." She watched him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Still silent. "I want to help," James continued. "I don't know how, but there has to be something I can do. Some way to start making this right." For a long moment, Ayana just looked at him. Then she spoke for the first time since their wedding day. "You can't make it right." Her voice was quiet but firm. "What's done is done." "Then what do you want from me?" "I want you to witness," she said. "I want you to see what your family's success cost my people. I want you to carry that knowledge back to your world when this is over." "When what's over?" She almost smiled. It wasn't warm. "This marriage. When the paperwork is settled and the contract fulfilled, you'll go back to Seattle. You'll take over your father's company, and maybe, just maybe, you'll remember what you learned here." Before James could respond, she closed the door. But something had shifted. She'd spoken to him. More than that, she'd revealed her plan. This was temporary in her mind. She was enduring it until some unknown endpoint, and then they'd both be free. James should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt strangely disappointed. The next week, the materials on his doorstep changed again. This time, they were about current issues facing the reservation. Budget shortfalls, healthcare access problems, educational challenges, the struggle to maintain cultural traditions while adapting to modern economic realities. James started paying more attention to the daily life around him. He noticed that the medical clinic was only open 3 days a week, that the school needed repairs but couldn't afford them. That many young people left the reservation for work because there weren't enough opportunities here. He also noticed how hard Ayana worked. She was at the community center before dawn most days, meeting with council members, reviewing budgets, making calls to state officials who rarely called back. She fought for her people with a tireless intensity that was both impressive and exhausting to watch. One evening, James was walking past the community center when he heard raised voices. Through the window, he could see Ayana in a heated discussion with several older men from the tribal council. "We can't afford to reject their offer," one man was saying. "The casino development would bring jobs, revenue. It would also bring crime, addiction, all the problems we've worked so hard to avoid," Ayana countered. "Our people deserve better than becoming dependent on gambling revenue." "Your idealism doesn't pay for health care," another council member said sharply. "While you're protecting our values, our kids are leaving because there's no future here." The meeting broke up without resolution. As the council members left, Ayana remained inside, her head in her hands, shoulders slumped in defeat. James knew he should walk away. She'd made it clear she didn't want his involvement. But he couldn't help himself. He knocked gently on the door. She looked up, surprised to see him. "What do you want?" "I heard the meeting. The casino proposal. Were you spying on me?" "No, I was just walking by. Look, I'm an engineer. I've worked on development projects. Maybe I could look at the proposal, see if there's a way to what? Make it better? Make it acceptable?" She stood up, angry now. "You think your expertise can solve this? You think you can swoop in and fix our problems?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" She walked closer, her eyes flashing. "What exactly do you think you can offer us? Money, business advice? Some innovative solution that we're apparently too simple to have thought of ourselves? I just want to help. We don't need your help. We need justice. We need our land back. We need the government to honor the treaties they broke. We need—" She stopped, taking a breath. "We need things you can't give us." They stood there in tense silence. Then Ayana's expression changed, softening slightly. "But you're trying," she said quietly. "I can see that. You're reading, you're learning. You're not the man I expected to marry. What did you expect? Someone who didn't care. Someone who would just wait out the contract and leave without looking back." She sat down again, suddenly looking tired. "My father arranged this marriage on his deathbed. He believed that binding our families together was the best revenge and the best hope. I've never been sure which. Revenge? making your family face what they did, making you live among the people your grandfather robbed. See what that theft cost us. That's revenge." She looked up at him. "But hope. Hope was that maybe someone from your family would finally understand, would finally see us as real people, not obstacles to profit." James sat down across from her, uninvited but not unwelcome. "I do see you. All of you. This place, these people, everything you're fighting for. I see it." "Good," Ayanna said. "Then my father's plan is working." For the first time since he'd arrived, James felt like they were actually talking. Not as strangers forced into marriage, but as two people trying to navigate an impossible situation. "The documentary you left me last week," James said, "about the boarding schools. There was a woman in it, must have been about 80 years old. She talked about how they cut her hair when she arrived, how she cried for days." Ayanna nodded. "My grandmother. She died 5 years ago. I'm sorry. She was strong. They tried to break her, but she held on to who she was. She taught my father our language in secret, passed down our stories." The morning started like any other. James made coffee in his small cabin, read through the latest research paper Ayanna had left for him about water rights disputes, and prepared for another day of learning about problems he was only beginning to understand. Then he heard the shouting. James stepped outside to see a crowd gathering, near the parking lot by the community center. At the center of the commotion, a middle-aged white man in expensive hiking gear was yelling at a group of kids, maybe 12 or 13 years old. "I paid good money for this tour," the man was saying, his face red with anger. "And these little," he used a slur that made James's stomach turn, "threw rocks at my car." "We didn't throw nothing at your car," one of the kids protested. "We were just shooting hoops and the ball bounced near it. Don't lie to me. I know your type. Probably don't even go to school, just run wild around here causing trouble." James was already moving toward the scene when he saw Ayanna emerge from the community center. Her expression was calm, but there was steel in her eyes. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice carrying authority. The tourist turned to her, looking her up and down dismissively. "Are you in charge? Because these kids damaged my vehicle and I want compensation." "I'm the chief of this tribe, yes, and I'd like to see the damage you're claiming." The man led them to his SUV, pointing at the side mirror.
See that?
Scratched. "These kids are vandals." Ayanna examined the mirror carefully. James looked too. The scratch was barely visible, looked old, and definitely hadn't been caused by a basketball. "That's not new damage," Ayanna said calmly. "And these children were playing basketball, not throwing rocks. How would you know?" "You weren't even here." "I was in my office with the window open. I heard everything, including you parking illegally in a space reserved for tribal members, and the kids politely telling you it was the wrong spot." The tourist's face got redder. "This is typical. You people always stick together, always playing the victim. I come here trying to support your economy with my tourist dollars, and this is the thanks I get? Our economy doesn't need support from people who call our children racial slurs," Ayanna said, her voice like ice now. "I didn't use any." "Yes, you did. I heard that too." She turned to the kids. "Go on to school. You're not in trouble." As the kids left, looking relieved, the tourist got more aggressive. "You can't just dismiss this." "I know my rights. I'll call the police, the state tourism board. I'll make sure everyone knows how hostile this place is to visitors." "Please do," Ayanna said. "And while you're at it, I'll make sure they know about your illegal parking, your verbal harassment of minors, and your false accusations. I have security cameras that recorded the entire incident." The man sputtered, clearly not expecting resistance. This is discrimination against white people." That's when James couldn't stay quiet anymore. "No, sir, it's called holding you accountable for your behavior." The tourist whirled on him. "Oh, great, another one of them." "I'm not Native American," James said. "I'm about as white as you are. And I'm telling you that you're wrong. Those kids didn't damage your car. You parked where you shouldn't have. And you owe them an apology." "I don't owe anyone anything." But the man was already backing toward his SUV, realizing he'd lost this confrontation.
This whole place is a joke.
"No wonder you people can't get ahead." He drove off, tires spitting gravel. The small crowd that had gathered dispersed slowly, people heading back to their daily routines but throwing grateful looks at Ayanna. James and Ayanna stood alone in the parking lot. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did. He was out of line." She studied him for a long moment, and James could practically see her reassessing him. "Come with me." she finally said. He followed her to a small cafe attached to the community center. She ordered 2 coffees and sat down at a table by the window. James sat across from her, waiting. That happens a lot, Ayanna said quietly. Tourists come here expecting some kind of authentic Native American experience. They want us to be characters in their vacation story, and when we're just regular people living regular lives, they get disappointed, sometimes hostile. That guy was more than hostile. He was racist. Yes, but most of them are more subtle about it. She took a sip of her coffee. You spoke up, why? Because it was wrong. Because those kids didn't deserve that. James paused. Because I'm starting to understand what it's like for you here. Dealing with that kind of thing while trying to run a community, while fighting for resources and respect that should be given freely. Ayanna was quiet for a while. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Softer, more open. I need to tell you something. About who I really am. James waited, curious. You think I'm just the chief of a small tribe trying to hold things together, and that's true, that's part of who I am. But it's not all of it. She pulled out her phone, showed him a photo of a degree hanging on a wall. I have a PhD in environmental law from Stanford. I graduated top of my class. James stared at the photo, then at her.
You what?
I specialized in indigenous land rights and corporate environmental justice. I've published 12 papers in law journals. I've consulted on cases across the country. She smiled slightly at his shocked expression. You thought I was uneducated? Simple? No, you never mentioned. Why would I? You're the man I was forced to marry to fix your grandfather's crimes. I didn't owe you my resume. But her tone wasn't bitter now, just matter of fact. I moved back here 5 years ago when my father got sick. I gave up a job offer from a major firm in San Francisco because my people needed me more than I needed a 6-figure salary. James felt like he'd been seeing everything wrong. The books you've been leaving me, you wrote some of those articles. 3 of them, yes, under my maiden name. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted you to learn without prejudice. If you knew those articles were written by your wife, the woman you were forced to marry, you might have dismissed them. But reading them as academic work, you had to engage with the arguments on their own merit. It was brilliant, actually, and a little manipulative, but mostly brilliant. What else haven't you told me? James asked. Ayanna leaned back in her chair. I'm working on the biggest case of my career. A lawsuit against 3 major corporations for illegal dumping of industrial waste on tribal lands. We have evidence of contamination affecting our water supply, our soil, our health. The case could set a national precedent for environmental justice, and that's incredible. How can I help? You can't, it's complicated, and we have lawyers, scientists, experts. I'm an engineer. Environmental systems are part of what I studied. If there's technical analysis needed, James, she stopped him with a raised hand. Why are you so eager to help? What's in it for you? It was a fair question. James thought about it honestly. Nothing's in it for me. Seeing that guy today, the way he talked to those kids, the way he looked at you like you were less than him, it made me angry. And if I'm angry about one incident, I can't imagine what it's like dealing with that attitude constantly, while also fighting corporate polluters and budget shortfalls and all the other battles you're facing. Ayanna watched him carefully. You've changed. When you first got here, you looked at this place like it was a prison sentence. It was. At first, James met her eyes. But I'm starting to see it differently. See you differently. They sat in silence for a moment. The morning sun streamed through the window, highlighting the steam rising from their coffee cups. The lawsuit. Ayanna said slowly. It hits a major roadblock tomorrow. The corporations filed a motion to suppress our key evidence. They're claiming the testing was done improperly, that the chain of custody was broken. It's a technicality, but it might work. What kind of testing? Soil and water samples showing toxic levels of heavy metals and chemical compounds. We had an independent lab analyze everything, but the defense is arguing that because the samples were collected by tribal members rather than certified environmental professionals, they're inadmissible. James's mind started racing. What if you had a certified engineer review the collection methodology and test results? Someone who could testify that the procedures were sound. We'd need someone credible. Someone with environmental engineering credentials and no obvious bias. I have a master's degree in environmental systems engineering from MIT, James said. I've testified as an expert witness twice in Seattle construction projects involving environmental impact. Ayanna stared at him. You're serious? Completely? Let me see the data. If the collection and testing were done properly, I can say so. If there are issues, I can identify them and maybe suggest ways to address them. Why would you do this? These are the kind of corporations your family does business with. This could damage your relationships, your future in the industry. Maybe that industry needs some damage. James surprised himself with how much he meant it. My grandfather built his fortune by stepping on people. My father maintained it the same way. I don't want to be the third generation of Richardson men who values profit over people. For the first time since he'd met her, Ayanna smiled at him. A real smile, warm and genuine. Okay, she said. Let's go to my office. I'll show you what we have. They spent the rest of the day going through data. The courthouse was 2 hours away in the county seat. James rode with Ayanna and her legal team, a quiet group of 3 lawyers who'd been working on the environmental case for over a year. They all knew what was at stake. The corporations are bringing their full legal team, one of the lawyers, a woman named Rita, explained to James. 12 attorneys from 3 different firms. They want to crush this case before it even gets to trial. James watched the Montana landscape roll by through the window. Will my testimony be enough? It should be, Ayanna said from the driver's seat. But nothing's certain in court. The hearing lasted 6 hours. James sat in the witness box for 90 minutes, answering questions about environmental testing procedures, chain of custody protocols, and the validity of the evidence. The corporate lawyers were aggressive, trying to paint him as biased because of his marriage to Ayanna. Isn't it true, Mr. Richardson, that you have a personal relationship with the plaintiff? One attorney asked, his tone suggesting something improper. I'm married to the tribal chief, yes. That's a matter of public record. So you have a vested interest in the outcome of this case. No more than you have a vested interest in protecting your client's profits, James replied calmly. My testimony is based on my professional expertise as an environmental engineer, not on my personal relationships. The judge agreed. James's declaration stood, and the motion to suppress evidence was denied. The case would move forward. Walking out of the courthouse, Ayanna was practically glowing with relief and triumph. You were amazing in there, she said. The way you handled their attacks and stayed calm, stuck to the facts. I just told the truth. The truth doesn't always win in court, but today it did. She stopped on the courthouse steps, looking at him seriously. This changes things, you know. The corporations will start investigating you now. They'll look for anything they can use to discredit you. Your business, your family, your past, and let them look. I've got nothing to hide. They drove back to the reservation in better spirits than they'd left. The legal team was celebrating, talking excitedly about their next steps. James felt useful for the first time in weeks, like he'd actually contributed something meaningful. But when they got back, there was a problem waiting. Helen was standing outside the community center, her expression worried. We need to talk, all of us. Council meeting in 10 minutes. The tribal council chamber was full. Besides the official council members, at least 20 other community members had showed up. James started to leave, thinking this was tribal business that didn't concern him. But Ayanna grabbed his arm. Stay, she said. You're part of this now. The issue was immediate and serious. The environmental lawsuit had made news. Local media had covered the hearing, and now one of the corporations involved was making threats. Not legal threats, but economic ones. They're threatening to pull their contracts with every business on the reservation, Helen explained. The convenience store, the construction company, even the medical clinic's supply contracts. They're trying to pressure us into dropping the lawsuit. Can they do that? Someone asked. Legally, yes, Ayanna said. They can choose who they do business with. And if they follow through, we're talking about at least 40 jobs lost, maybe more. The room erupted in worried conversation. James listened as people debated what to do. Some wanted to continue the fight regardless of the cost. Others worried about their families, their livelihoods. We can't let them bully us, one council member said. Easy for you to say, another responded. You're retired. Some of us have kids to feed. James raised his hand, feeling awkward about speaking in this setting. Ayanna nodded at him. What if we found alternative contracts? He said. I have connections in Seattle, companies that might be interested in working with the reservation, especially if we can frame it as supporting indigenous communities. That would take time, Helen said. These contracts are getting canceled in 30 days. Then we work fast. James pulled out his phone. I can make some calls tonight. My former company, they're always looking for reliable suppliers. And I know other firms that have diversity initiatives. It's not charity, it's good business. Ayanna looked at him with something like wonder. You'd do that? Risk your professional relationships? They're not much of a relationship if they'd punish me for doing the right thing. That night, James barely slept. He spent hours on the phone sending emails, making pitches. He called in every favor he had, reached out to contacts he hadn't spoken to in years, and worked his professional network harder than he ever had before. Some people said no. Some didn't respond, but some said yes. By morning, he had preliminary interest from 4 companies in Seattle. It wasn't enough to replace everything the tribe was losing, but it was a start. Ayanna showed up at his cabin at 7 in the morning with coffee and breakfast sandwiches from the cafe. You were up all night, she said, noticing the dark circles under his eyes. Mostly, yeah. I got some commitments, though. Not enough, but something. She sat down at his small kitchen table, and James noticed she looked tired, too. I was working on Plan B, she said. Figuring out how we can cut costs, consolidate services, keep people employed even if we lose the contracts. We shouldn't have to do that. They're the ones polluting your land, and now they're punishing you for speaking up about it. Welcome to environmental justice work, Ayanna said with a tired smile. The powerful companies always have more resources, more options, more ways to hurt communities that fight back. They spent the day working together. James on his laptop coordinating with Seattle contacts. Ayanna on her phone negotiating and preparing for worst-case scenarios. Around noon, they took a break and walked to the cafe for lunch. Can I ask you something? James said as they ate. Why become a lawyer instead of working in environmental engineering yourself? You clearly understand the technical side. Because engineers can tell you what's wrong, but lawyers can force people to fix it, Ayanna said. I wanted the power to hold corporations accountable, not just document their crimes. That makes sense. You're good at it, too. The way you argued in court yesterday, my father wanted me to come home and be chief. Traditional leadership, focus on cultural preservation, that kind of thing. She picked at her sandwich. But I couldn't just preserve our past while our future was being poisoned. I had to fight for both. He must have been proud of you. He was worried I'd burn out. He said fighting the powerful was like swimming against a river. You could exhaust yourself and still end up back where you started. She smiled sadly. He wasn't wrong. But I can't stop swimming. James understood that feeling. The more he learned about the challenges facing the reservation, the more he wanted to help solve them. It was exhausting and frustrating and somehow energizing all at once. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Early mornings reviewing legal documents and technical data, afternoons making phone calls and attending meetings, evenings going over strategy for the lawsuit and the economic pressure campaign. They worked well together. James's engineering background helped him spot weaknesses in the corporate defense arguments. Ayanna's legal expertise helped her turn those weaknesses into winning points. When James got too focused on the technical details, Ayanna pulled him back to the bigger picture. When Ayanna got frustrated with legal obstacles, James reminded her of the scientific facts that couldn't be argued away. We balance each other, Ayanna said one night, as they reviewed their progress. You see the trees, I see the forest. I think you mean the other way around. No, I mean what I said. You focus on the specific problems, the individual solutions. I'm always thinking about the systemic issues, the long-term implications. We need both perspectives. James realized she was right. They'd become effective partners, complementing each other's strengths and compensating for each other's weaknesses. The breakthrough came on a Friday evening. James got a call from his old boss in Seattle, a man named David who ran a major construction firm. I talked to some people, David said, about your situation, about the reservation contracts. I can't replace everything they're losing, but I can offer a 3-year agreement for construction materials and labor. If the tribe has people who can do the work, they do, James said immediately. The construction company here is excellent. I've seen their work. Good, send me their information. And James, what you're doing, standing up to those corporations, I respect that. A lot of people in our industry don't. But I do. When James told Ayanna the news, she actually hugged him. It was brief and probably meant as a professional gesture, but it made James's heart race anyway. This is huge, she said, pulling back quickly. With this contract, we can keep most of the construction jobs. That's 20 families who won't have to worry. We still need more, James said, trying to ignore how good it had felt to have her in his arms. But it's progress. By the end of the month, they'd secured enough contracts to offset about 60% of what the tribe was losing. It wasn't perfect, but it was survivable. More importantly, it showed the corporations that their economic pressure campaign had failed. The environmental lawsuit moved forward. Discovery began, which meant both sides were exchanging documents and information. The tribal council meeting was packed. Every seat was filled with people standing along the walls. James sat in the back corner, where he'd become accustomed to sitting during these gatherings. He'd learned to observe, to listen, to understand the complex dynamics of tribal governance. But today felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that something important was about to happen. Ayanna stood at the front of the room, looking calm and composed in a way that James had learned meant she was about to do something significant. She'd been quieter than usual the past few days, more withdrawn. He'd assumed she was stressed about the lawsuit or the ongoing economic pressures from the corporations. He'd been wrong. "Thank you all for coming," Ayanna began. "I've called this special meeting because I have an announcement to make. One that will affect all of us and one that I hope will change our future." She pulled up a presentation on the screen behind her. Financial documents, trust fund statements, legal papers. As many of you know, my father established a trust for me when I was born. It's been growing for 30 years, carefully managed and invested. The current value is $2,300,000. There were murmurs in the crowd. That was a fortune by reservation standards, where the average family income was barely $40,000 a year. This money was meant to ensure my future, to give me security and options. But I've been thinking about what kind of future I want and what kind of future I want for all of us. Ayanna clicked to the next slide. "So I'm donating the entire amount to establish the Crow Feather Educational Foundation." The room exploded in shocked conversation. James sat up straighter, stunned. "The foundation will provide full scholarships for tribal youth who want to pursue degrees in law, environmental science, engineering, medicine, or education. We'll cover tuition, books, housing, everything. My goal is to create a new generation of professionals who can come back here and fight for our people with the skills and credentials that the outside world respects." Helen stood up, her voice shaking. "Ayanna, that's your entire inheritance. Everything your father left you, I know. But he left me something more valuable than money. He left me a community worth fighting for. This is how I choose to fight." More slides appeared on the screen, showing the foundation structure, the scholarship criteria, the mentorship program she'd designed. It was comprehensive, well thought out, clearly something she'd been planning for a while. But then she clicked to another slide, and James felt his blood run cold. "There's more," Ayanna said, her voice taking on an edge. "I'm also using my position to renegotiate the terms of the Richardson land development deal." A photograph of James's father appeared on the screen, along with legal documents. Then photos of the stolen land, the sacred sites that had been destroyed, the profits the Richardson family had made. "My marriage to James Richardson was arranged to settle a debt. But I've decided that the current terms aren't good enough. They don't come close to making things right." She looked directly at James for the first time. "So I'm proposing new terms." The next slide was a detailed contract. James tried to read it from across the room, his heart pounding. "First, the Richardson Development Company will enter into a profit-sharing agreement with the tribe. 20% of all profits from the Montana development will come back to this community in perpetuity." Gasps and whispers filled the room. "Second, all development on that land will meet the strictest environmental standards, verified by independent inspectors hired by the tribe. Third, the Richardson Company will give hiring preference to tribal members for all positions at the development, from construction to management. Fourth, a portion of the land, including the sacred burial sites, will be returned to tribal ownership, with legal protections ensuring it can never be developed." James sat frozen, watching his wife dismantle his family's business deal piece by piece and rebuild it into something that actually served justice. "And if the Richardson family refuses these terms?" someone asked. Ayanna's smile was sharp. "Then I use my marriage to James as leverage. As his wife, I have access to family documents, business records, communications, and I've discovered some very interesting things about how that land deal was structured. things that would be of great interest to federal prosecutors. The room went silent. James felt like he couldn't breathe. I'm giving them a choice, Ayanna continued. They can do the right thing voluntarily, or they can face legal consequences that will destroy their business entirely. Either way, our people get what they're owed. She was using him, using their marriage, using everything he'd shared with her, using the trust he'd started to feel. James stood up abruptly and everyone turned to look at him. I need air, he said, and walked out. Outside, the late afternoon sun was too bright. James walked without direction, just needing to move, to think, to process what had just happened. She'd played him. All of it. The shared work on the lawsuit, the late nights planning strategy, the moments where he'd thought they were becoming friends or maybe something more. She'd been gathering ammunition, learning about his family's business. Preparing for this, he'd been an idiot. James ended up at the edge of the reservation, where the land opened up into grassland and distant mountains. He sat on a large rock and put his head in his hands. You left before the vote? Ayanna's voice came from behind him. He didn't turn around. What vote? The council needed to approve my proposal. They did. Unanimously. She came to stand beside him, but he still didn't look at her. You're angry. You used me. Yes. Her honesty was somehow worse than a lie would have been. James finally looked up at her. Was any of it real? The work on the lawsuit, the conversations, any of it? Ayanna sat down on another rock facing him. The lawsuit is real. Your help made a real difference there, and the conversations were real too. I did want you to understand, to see what your family's actions cost us. But you were also gathering information to use against them. Against me. You're not your family, James, I know that now. But yes, I was planning this from the beginning. The marriage gave me access, gave me leverage. I'd be a fool not to use it. So what was I supposed to be? Your accomplice. Did you think I'd just go along with this? I thought you'd do what's right, Ayanna said quietly. You've spent months learning about the injustice, seeing the struggles we face, understanding how your family's wealth was built on our loss. I thought when the moment came you'd stand with us, by betraying my own father, my family, by choosing justice over comfort, by deciding that being a Richardson doesn't mean protecting Richardson crimes. She leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. Your grandfather stole from us. Your father tried to avoid making it right. You're the first one who's actually seen us as human beings. So yes, I'm asking you to betray your family's legacy, because that legacy is built on theft and lies. James wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Everything she said was true. He'd read the documents, seen the evidence, understood exactly how his family's fortune had been made. What if I refuse? He asked. What if I warn them, help them fight this? Then you're choosing to be like them, and I'll fight you too. Ayanna stood up. But I don't think you will. I think you're better than that. She started to walk away, then stopped. The council meeting continues in an hour. We're voting on the specific terms to present to your family. You're welcome to attend. Your input would actually be valuable, since you know how they think, how they negotiate. Then she was gone, leaving James alone with his impossible choice. An hour later, he walked back into the council chamber. Ayanna didn't look surprised to see him, but she didn't smile either. She just nodded at an empty chair and continued the discussion. James listened as they debated the details. Some wanted to demand more, push harder. Others worried about pushing too hard and getting nothing. Helen suggested building in timeline requirements to prevent stalling tactics. What do you think? Ayanna finally asked him directly. How will your family respond to this? Everyone looked at James. He took a breath. My father will fight it. He'll see it as extortion, as you taking advantage of the marriage. He'll hire lawyers and try to find ways to void the original contract. James paused. But I also know the company's finances. I've seen the projections for the Montana development. 20% profit sharing will hurt, but it won't kill the deal. The environmental standards will increase costs, but not impossibly. And the hiring preferences actually make good PR sense. So it's workable? One council member asked. It's workable, James confirmed. If they're smart, they'll take it. The alternative, having their illegal land acquisition exposed, would destroy them completely. And will you help us? Ayanna asked. Help present this to your family? Help negotiate the terms? This was the moment. The choice that would define everything going forward. James looked around the room at the faces of people who'd become more than strangers to him over the past months. People who'd been wronged and were finally demanding justice. People who deserved better than what his family had given them. Then he looked at Ayanna, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Hope, maybe. Or calculation. Or something else entirely. Yes, he said. I'll help. But on one condition. What condition? The flight to Seattle felt like traveling to another world. James hadn't been back in 3 months, and as the plane descended through the familiar gray clouds, he felt like a stranger returning to a place that used to be home. Ayanna sat beside him, looking out the window at the city below. She'd dressed carefully for this meeting in a sharp business suit that made her look every bit the Stanford-educated lawyer she was. The traditional jewelry she sometimes wore on the reservation was gone, replaced by simple silver earrings. She was code-switching, James realized, presenting herself in a way that his family's world would respect. You okay? He asked quietly. I've faced hostile boardrooms before. This won't be my first or my last. But James noticed her hands were clenched in her lap, tension evident in every line of her body. This wasn't just another business meeting for her. This was personal. They'd spent 2 weeks preparing, late nights going over every clause of the proposed contract, anticipating objections, preparing responses. Somewhere in there, the wall between them had started coming down again. James caught her smiling at his jokes. She'd brought him coffee without being asked. Small things, but they meant something. Or maybe he was just seeing what he wanted to see. His father's office was in the Richardson Building downtown, a 30-story tower that bore the family name in huge letters across the top. James had always been proud of that building. Now it just looked like a monument to money earned through exploitation. The receptionist recognized James immediately. Mr. Richardson, we weren't expecting you. Your father didn't mention. This is a surprise visit, James said. Is he available? He's in a meeting with the board, but I'm sure he'll. Perfect. We'll join him. Before the receptionist could protest, James led Ayanna down the familiar hallway to the boardroom. Through the glass walls, he could see his father at the head of a long table, surrounded by a dozen executives and lawyers. The Montana project was displayed on screens around the room. James opened the door without knocking. James. His father stood up, shocked. What are you doing here? We need to talk about Montana. James walked in, Ayanna right behind him. This is my wife, Ayanna. I believe you've spoken on the phone. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. James's father looked at Ayanna with barely concealed hostility. The board members whispered to each other, clearly confused about what was happening. This is a closed board meeting, his father said tightly. Whatever this is, it can wait. No, it can't. James pulled out a flash drive from his pocket. Because we're here to present new terms for the Montana development. Terms that the tribe requires before they allow the project to proceed. We have a contract based on fraud and stolen land, Ayanna said calmly. Would you like me to explain to your board exactly how this company acquired that property? I have documents. James's father's face went red. You dare to come into my office. Dad, sit down and listen. James's voice was firm. Because if you don't, the next conversation will be with federal prosecutors and it won't go nearly as well for you. For a long moment, father and son stared at each other. Then his father slowly sat down, gesturing curtly at 2 empty chairs. James plugged in the flash drive. The presentation appeared on all the screens, replacing the development plans. First, the evidence of the original land theft. Documents his grandfather had forged. Maps showing the sacred sites that had been destroyed. Legal analysis of the crimes committed. The board members looked increasingly uncomfortable. Several of them hadn't known, James could tell. They'd thought this was a legitimate business deal. In 1987, Richardson Development acquired 4,000 acres through illegal means. Ayanna began, her voice professional and clear. My father, the tribal chief at that time,